Chapter 29 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elli. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 29. How the Wicked Tanuki was Punished. The hunters had hunted the wood for so many years that no wild animal was any more to be found in it. You might walk from one end to the other without ever seeing a hare, or a deer, or a boar, or hearing the cooing of the doves in their nest. If they were not dead, they had flown elsewhere. Only three creatures remained alive, and they had hidden themselves in the thickest part of the forest, high up in the mountain. These were the gray-furred, long-tailed Tanuki, his wife the fox, who was one of his own family, and their little son. The fox and the Tanuki were very clever, prudent beasts, and they also were skilled in magic, and by this means had escaped the fate of their unfortunate friends. If they heard the twang of an arrow, or saw the glitter of a spear ever so far off, they lay very still, and were not to be tempted from the hiding place, if their hunger was ever so great, or the game ever so delicious. "We are not foolish as to risk our lives," they said to each other proudly. But at length there came a day when, in spite of their prudence, they seemed likely to die of starvation, for no more food was to be had. Something had to be done, but they did not know what. Suddenly a bright thought struck the Tanuki. "I've got a plan," he cried joyfully to his wife. "I will pretend to be dead, and you must change yourself into a man and take me to the village for sale. It will be easy to find a buyer. Tanuki's skins are always wanted. Then buy some food with the money and come home again. I will manage to escape somehow, so do not worry about me." The fox laughed with delight and rubbed her paws together with satisfaction. "Well, next time I will go," she said, "and you can sell me." And then she changed herself into a man, and picking up the stiff body of the Tanuki, set off towards the village. She found him rather heavy, but it would never have done to let him walk through the wood and risk his being seen by somebody. As the Tanuki had foretold, buyers were many, and the fox handed him over to the person who offered the largest price, and hurried to get some food with the money. The buyer took the Tanuki back to his house, and throwing him into a corner, went out. Directly the Tanuki found he was alone, he crept cautiously through a chink in the window, thinking, as he did so, how lucky it was that he was not a fox, and was able to climb. Once outside, he hid himself in a ditch till it grew dusk, and then galloped away into the forest. While the food lasted, they were all three as happy as kings. But there soon arrived the day when the larder was as empty as ever. "It is my turn now to pretend to be dead," cried the fox. So the Tanuki changed himself into a peasant, and started for the village with his wife's body hanging over his shoulder. A buyer was not long in coming forward, and while they were making the bargain, a wicked thought darted into the Tanuki's mind, that if he got rid of the fox, there would be more food for him and his son. So, as he put the money in his pocket, he whispered softly to the buyer that the fox was not really dead, and that if he did not take care she might run away from him. The man did not need twice telling. He gave the poor fox a blow on the head, which put an end to her, and the wicked Tanuki went smiling to the nearest shop. In the former times he had been very fond of his little son, but since he had betrayed his wife he seemed to have changed all in a moment, for he would not give him as much as a bite, and the poor little fellow would have starved had he not found nuts and berries to eat, and he waited on, always hoping that his mother would come back. At length some notion of the truth began to dawn on him, but he was careful to let the old Tanuki see nothing, though in his own mind he turned over plans from morning till night, wondering how best he might avenge his mother. One morning, as the little Tanuki was sitting with his father, he remembered with a start that his mother had taught him all she knew of magic, and that he could work spells as well as his father, or perhaps better. "I'm as good a wizard as you," he said suddenly, and a cold chill ran through the Tanuki as he heard him, though he laughed and pretended to think it a joke. But the little Tanuki stuck to his point, and at last the father proposed they should have a wager. "Change yourself into any shape you like," said he, "and I will undertake to know you. I will go and wait on the bridge which leads over the river to the village, and you shall transform yourself into anything you please, but I will know you through any disguise." The little Tanuki agreed, and went down the road which his father had pointed out. But instead of transforming himself into a different shape, he just hid himself in a corner of the bridge, where he could see without being seen. He had not been there long when his father arrived and took up his place near the middle of the bridge, and soon after the king came by, followed by a troop of guards and all of his court. "Ah, he thinks that now he has changed himself into a king I shall not know him," thought the old Tanuki, and as the king passed in his splendid carriage borne by his servants, he jumped upon it crying, "I have won my wager, you cannot deceive me." But in reality it was he who had deceived himself. The soldiers, conceiving that the king was being attacked, seized the Tanuki by the legs and flung him over into the river, and the water closed over him. And the little Tanuki saw it all and rejoiced that his mother's death had been avenged. Then he went back to the forest, and if he has not found it too lonely, he is probably living there still. From Japanische Märchen. End of How the Wicked Tanuki Was Punished. Recording by Elli. July 2010.
Chapter 30 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bree. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 30. The Crab and the Monkey. There once was a crab who lived in a hole on the shady side of a mountain. She was a very good housewife, and so careful and industrious that there was no creature in the whole country whose hole was so neat and clean as hers, and she took great pride in it. One day she saw lying near the mouth of her hole a handful of cooked rice, which some pilgrim must have let fall when he was stopping to eat his dinner. Delighted at this discovery, she hastened to the spot, and was carrying the rice back to her hole, when a monkey, who lived in some trees near by, came down to see what the crab was doing. His eyes shone at the sight of the rice, for it was his favorite food, and, like the sly fellow he was, he proposed a bargain to the crab. She was to give him half the rice in exchange for the kernel of a sweet red cocky fruit which he had just eaten. He half expected that the crab would laugh in his face at this impudent proposal, but instead of doing so, she only looked at him for a moment with her head on one side, and then said that she would agree to the exchange. So the monkey went off with his rice, and the crab returned to her hole with the kernel. For some time the crab saw no more of the monkey, who had gone to pay a visit on the sunny side of the mountain. But one morning he happened to pass by her hole, and found her sitting under the shadow of a beautiful kaki tree. "Good day," he said politely. "You have some very fine fruit there. I am very hungry. Could you spare me one or two?" "Oh, certainly," replied the crab. "But you must forgive me if I cannot get them for you myself. I am no tree climber." "Pray do not apologize," answered the monkey. "Now that I have your permission, I can get them myself quite easily." And the crab consented to let him go up, merely saying that he must throw her down half the fruit. In another moment he was swinging himself from branch to branch, eating all the ripest kakis and filling his pockets with the rest, and the poor crab saw to her disgust that the few he threw down to her were either not ripe at all, or else quite rotten. "You are a shocking rogue!" she called in a rage, but the monkey took no notice, and went on eating as fast as he could. The crab understood that it was no use her scolding, so she resolved to try what cunning would do. "Sir Monkey," she said, "you are certainly a very good climber, but now that you have eaten so much, I am quite sure you would never be able to turn one of your somersaults." The monkey prided himself on turning better somersaults than any of his family, so instantly went head over heels 3 times on the bough on which he was sitting, and all the beautiful kakis that he had in his pockets rolled to the ground. Quick as lightning the crab picked them up and carried a quantity of them into her house, but when she came up for another the monkey sprang on her and treated her so badly that he left her for dead. When he had beaten her till his arm ached, he went his way. It was a lucky thing for the poor crab that she had some friends to come to her help, or she certainly would have died then and there. The wasp flew to her and took her back to bed and looked after her, and then he consulted with a rice mortar and an egg which had fallen out of a nest near by, and they agreed that when the monkey returned, as he was sure to do, to steal the rest of the fruit, that they would punish him severely for the manner in which he had behaved to the crab. So the mortar climbed up to the beam over the front door, and the egg lay quite still on the ground, while the wasp set down the water bucket in a corner. Then the crab dug itself a deep hole in the ground, so that not even the tip of her claws might be seen. Soon after everything was ready, the monkey jumped down from his tree, and, creeping to the door, began a long hypocritical speech, asking pardon for all he had done. He waited for an answer of some sort, but none came. He listened, but all was still. Then he peeped, and saw no one. Then he went in. He peered about for the crab, but in vain. However, his eyes fell on the egg, which he snatched up and set on the fire. But in a moment the egg had burst into 1,000 pieces, and its sharp shell struck him in the face and scratched him horribly. Smarting with the pain, he ran to the bucket and stooped down to throw some water over his head. As he stretched out his hand, up started the wasp and stung him on the nose. The monkey shrieked and ran to the door, but as he passed through, down fell the mortar and struck him dead. After that, the crab lived happily for many years, and at length died in peace under her own cocky tree. End of chapter 30. The Crab and the Monkey. Recording by Bree, Richmond, Virginia.
Chapter 31 of the Crimson Fairy Book.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Recording by Jefferson, Montoya. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 31. The horse Gullfaxi and the sword Gunnfoder. Many, many years ago there lived a king and queen who had only one son called Sigurd. When the little boy was only 10 years old, the queen, his mother, fell ill and died, and the king, who loved her dearly, built a splendid monument to his wife's memory. And day after day he sat by it and bewailed his sad loss. One morning, as he sat by the grave, he noticed a richly dressed lady close to him. He asked her name, and she answered that it was Ingiborg, and seemed surprised to see the king there all alone. Then he told her how he had lost his queen, and how he came daily to weep at her grave. In return, the lady informed him that she had lately lost her husband, and suggested they might both find it a comfort if they made friends. This pleased the king so much that he invited her to his palace, where they saw each other often, and after a time he married her. After the wedding was over, he soon regained his good spirits and used to ride out hunting as in old days, but Sigurd, who was very fond of his stepmother, always stayed at home with her. One evening Ingiborg said to Sigurd, "Tomorrow your father is going out hunting, and you must go with him." But Sigurd said he would much rather stay at home, and the next day when the king rode off, Sigurd refused to accompany him. The stepmother was very angry, but he would not listen, and at last she assured him that he would be sorry for his disobedience, and that in future he had better do as he was told. After the hunting party had started, she hid Sigurd under her bed, and bade him be sure to lie there till she called him. Sigurd lay very still for a long while, and was just thinking it was no good staying there any more, when he felt the floor shake under him as if there were an earthquake, and peeping out he saw a great giantess wading along ankle-deep through the ground and ploughing it up as she walked. "Good morning, Sister Ingiborg," cried she as she entered the room. "Is Prince Sigurd at home?" "No," said Ingiborg. "He rode off to the forest with his father this morning. And she laid the table for her sister and set food before her. After they had both done eating, the giantess said, "Thank you, sister, for your good dinner. The best lamb, the best can of beer, and the best drink I have ever had. But is not Prince Sigurd at home?" Ingiborg again said no, and the giantess took leave of her and went away. When she was quite out of sight, Ingiborg told Sigurd to come out of his hiding place. The king returned home at night, but his wife told him nothing of what had happened, and the next morning she again begged the prince to go hunting with his father. Sigurd, however, replied as before that he would much rather stay at home. So once more the king rode off alone. This time Ingiborg hid Sigurd under the table and scolded him well for not doing as she bade him. For some time he lay quite still, and then suddenly the floor began to shake, and a giantess came along, wading halfway to her knees through the ground. As she entered the house, she asked, as the first had done, "Well, sister Ingiborg, is Prince Sigurd at home?" "No," answered Ingiborg. "He rode off hunting with his father this morning," and going to the cupboard, she laid the table for her sister. When they had finished their meal, the giantess rose and said, "Thank you for all these nice dishes, and for the best lamb, the best can of beer, and the nicest drink I've ever had, but is Prince Sigurd really not at home?" "No, certainly not," replied Ingiborg, and with that they took leave of each other. When she was well out of sight, Sigurd crept from under the table, and his stepmother declared that it was most important that he should not stay at home the next day, but he said he did not see what harm could come of it, and he did not mean to go out hunting. And the next morning, when the king prepared to start, Ingiborg implored Sigurd to accompany his father. But it was all no use. He was quite obstinate and would not listen to a word she said. "You will have to hide me again," said he. So no sooner had the king gone than Ingiborg hid Sigurd between the wall and the paneling. And by there was heard once more a sound like an earthquake as a great giantess, wading knee-deep through the ground, came in at the door. "Good day, sister Ingiborg," she cried in a voice like thunder. "Is Prince Sigurd at home?" "Oh no," answered Ingiborg. "He is enjoying himself out there in the forest. I expect it will be quite dark before he comes back again." "That's a lie," shouted the giantess, and they squabbled about it till they were tired, after which Ingiborg laid the table, and when the giantess had done eating, she said, "Well, I must thank you for all these good things, and for the best lamb, the best can of beer, and the best drink I have had for a long time, but are you quite sure Prince Sigurd is not at home?" "Quite," said Ingiborg. "I've told you already that he rode off with his father this morning to hunt in the forest." At this the giantess roared out with a terrible voice, "If he is near enough to hear my words, I lay this spell upon him. Let him be half scorched and half withered, and may he neither have rest nor peace until he finds me." And with these words she stalked off. For a moment Ingiborg stood as if turned to stone. Then she fetched Sigurd from his hiding place, and to her horror there he was, half scorched and half withered. "Now you see what has happened through your own obstinacy," she said. "But we must lose no time, for your father will soon be coming home." Going quickly into the next room, she opened a chest and took out a ball of string and 3 gold rings, and gave them to Sigurd, saying, "If you throw this ball on the ground, it will roll along till it reaches some high cliffs. There you will see a giantess looking out over the rocks. She will call down to you and say, 'Ah, this is just what I wanted. Here is Prince Sigurd. He shall go into the pot tonight.' But don't be frightened by her. She will draw you up with a long boat hook, and you must greet her from me and give her the smallest ring as a present. This will please her, and she will ask you to wrestle with her. When you are exhausted, she will offer you a horn to drink out of, and though she does not know it, the wine will make you so strong that you will easily be able to conquer her. After that, she will let you stay there all night. The same thing will happen with my 2 other sisters. But above all, remember this: Should my little dog come to you and lay his paws on you with tears running down his face, then hurry home, for my life will be in danger. Now, goodbye, and don't forget your stepmother." Then Ingiborg dropped the ball on the ground, and Sigurd bade her farewell. That same evening, the ball stopped rolling at the foot of some high rocks, and on glancing up, Sigurd saw the giantess looking out at the top. "Ah, just what I wanted!" she cried out when she saw him. "Here is Prince Sigurd. He shall go into the pot tonight. Come up, my friend, and wrestle with me." With these words, she reached out a long boat hook and hauled him up the cliff. At first Sigurd was rather frightened, but he remembered what Ingiborg had said and gave the giantess her sister's message and the ring. The giantess was delighted and challenged him to wrestle with her. Sigurd was fond of all games and began to wrestle with joy, but he was no match for the giantess, and as she noticed that he was getting faint, she gave him a horn to drink out of, which was very foolish on her part, as it made Sigurd so strong that soon he overthrew her. "You may stay here tonight," she said, and he was glad of the rest. Next morning Sigurd threw down the ball again, and away it rolled for some time, till it stopped at the foot of another high rock. Then he looked up and saw another giantess, even bigger and uglier than the first one, who called out to him, "Ah, this is just what I wanted! Here is Prince Sigurd. He shall go into the pot tonight. Come up quickly and wrestle with me." And she lost no time hauling him up. The prince gave her his stepmother's message and the second largest ring. The giantess was greatly pleased when she saw the ring, and at once challenged Sigurd to wrestle with her. They struggled for a long time, till at last Sigurd grew faint. So she handed him a horn to drink from, and when he had drunk, he became so strong that he threw her down with one hand. On the third morning, Sigurd once more laid down his ball, and it rolled far away, till at last it stopped under a very high rock indeed, over the top of which the most hideous giantess that ever was seen looked down. When she saw who was there, she cried out, "Ah, this is just what I wanted! Here comes Prince Sigurd! Into the pot he goes this very night. Come up here, my friend, and wrestle with me." And she hauled him up, just as her sisters had done. Sigurd then gave her his stepmother's message and the last and largest ring. The sight of the red gold delighted the giantess, and she challenged Sigurd to a wrestling match. This time the fight was fierce and long, but when at length Sigurd's strength was failing, the giantess gave him something to drink, and after he had drunk it, he soon brought her to her knees. "You have beaten me," she gasped. "So now listen to me. Not far from here is a lake. Go there and you will find a little girl playing with a boat. Try to make friends with her and give her this little gold ring. You are stronger than you ever were, and I wish you good luck." With these words they took leave of each other, and Sigurd wandered on till he reached the lake, where he found the little girl playing with the boat, just as he'd been told. He went up to her and asked what her name was. She was called Helga, she answered, and she lived nearby. So Sigurd gave her the little gold ring and proposed that they should have a game. The little girl was delighted, for she had no brothers or sisters, and they played together all the rest of the day. When evening came, Sigurd asked leave to go home with her, but Helga at first forbade him, as no stranger had ever managed to enter their house without being found out by her father, who was a very fierce giant. However, Sigurd persisted, and at length she gave way. But when they came near the door, she held her glove over him, and Sigurd was at once transformed into a bundle of wool. Helga took the bundle under her arm and threw it on the bed in her room. At almost the same moment, her father rushed in and hunted around in every corner, crying out, "This place smells of men! What's that you threw on the bed, Helga?" "A bundle of wool," she said. "Oh, well, perhaps it was that I smelt," said the old man, and troubled himself no more. The following day, Helga went out to play and took the bundle of wool with her under her arm. When she reached the lake, she held her glove over it again, and Sigurd resumed his own shape. They played the whole day, and Sigurd taught Helga all sorts of games she had never even heard of. As they walked home in the evening, she said, "We shall be able to play better still tomorrow, for my father will have to go to the town, so we can stay at home." When they were near the house, Helga again held her glove over Sigurd, and once more he was turned into a bundle of wool, and she carried him in without his being seen. The very next morning Helga's father went to the town, and as soon as he was well out of the way, the girl held up her glove and Sigurd was himself again. Then she took him all over the house to amuse him and opened every room, for her father had given her the keys before he left. But when they came to the last room, Sigurd noticed one key on the bunch which had not been used and asked which room it belonged to. Helga grew red and did not answer. "I suppose you don't mind my seeing the room which it opens?" asked Sigurd, and as he spoke he saw a heavy iron door and begged Helga to unlock it for him. But she told him she dared not do so. At least if she did open the door, it must only be a very tiny chink, and Sigurd declared that that would do quite well. The door was so heavy that it took Helga some time to open it, and Sigurd grew so impatient that he pushed it wide open and walked in. There he saw a splendid horse, already saddled, and just above it hung a richly ornamented sword, on the handle of which was engraved these words, "He who rides this horse and wears this sword will find happiness." At the sight of the horse, Sigurd was so filled with wonder that he was not able to speak, but at last he gasped out, "Oh, do let me mount him and ride him around the house. Just once, I promise not to ask any more." "Ride him around the house?" cried Helga, growing pale at the mere idea. "Ride Gullfaxi? Why, father would never forgive me if I let you do that." "But it can't do him any harm," argued Sigurd. "You don't know how careful I will be. I've ridden all sorts of horses at home and have never fallen off, not once. Oh, Helga, do." "Well, perhaps, if you come back directly," replied Helga, doubtfully. "But you must be very quick, or father will find out." But instead of mounting Gullfaxi, as she expected, Sigurd stood still. "And the sword," he said, looking fondly up at the place where it hung. "My father is a king, but he has not got any sword as beautiful as that. Why, the jewels in the scabbard are more splendid than the big ruby in his crown. Has it got a name? Some swords have, you know." "It is called Gunnfoder, the battle plume," answered Helga, "and Gullfaxi means golden mane." "I don't suppose, if you are to get on the horse at all, it would matter your taking the sword too. And if you take the sword, you'll have to carry the stick and the stone and the twig as well." "They are easily carried," said Sigurd, gazing at them with scorn. "What wretched dried-up things! Why in the world do you keep them?" "Father says that he would rather lose Gullfaxi than lose them," replied Helga. "For if the man who rides the horse is pursued, he has only to throw the twig behind him, and it will turn into a forest so thick that even a bird could hardly fly through. But if his enemy happens to know magic and can throw down the forest, the man has only to strike the stone with the stick, and hailstones as large as pigeons' eggs will rain down from the sky and will kill everyone for 20 miles around." Having said all this, she allowed Sigurd to ride just once round the house, taking the sword and the other things with him. But when he had ridden round, instead of dismounting, he suddenly turned the horse's head and galloped away. Soon after this, Helga's father came home and found his daughter in tears. He asked what was the matter, and when he heard all that had happened, he rushed off as fast as he could to pursue Sigurd. Now, as Sigurd happened to look behind him, he saw the giant coming after him with great strides, and in all haste he threw the twig behind him. Immediately, such a thick wood sprang up at once between him and his enemy, and the giant was obliged to run home for an axe with which to cut his way through. Next time Sigurd glanced around, the giant was so near that he almost touched Gullfaxi's tail. In an agony of fear, Sigurd turned quickly in his saddle and hit the stone with the stick. No sooner had he done this than a terrible hailstorm burst behind, and the giant was killed on the spot. But had Sigurd struck the stone without turning around, the hail would have driven right into his face and killed him instead. After the giant was dead, Sigurd rode on towards his home, and on the way he suddenly met his stepmother's little dog running to meet him with tears pouring down its face. He galloped as hard as he could, and on arriving found 9 men servants in the act of tying Queen Ingeborg to a post in the courtyard of the palace, where they intended to burn her. Wild with anger, Prince Sigurd sprang from his horse and, sword in hand, fell on the men and killed them all. Then he released his stepmother and went in with her to see his father. The king lay in bed, sick with sorrow, and neither eating nor drinking, for he thought his son had been killed by the queen. He could hardly believe his own eyes for joy when he saw the prince, and Sigurd told him all his adventures. After that, Prince Sigurd rode back to fetch Helga, and a great feast was made, which lasted 3 days, and everyone said no bride was ever seen so beautiful as Helga, and they lived happily for many, many years, and everybody loved them. From Icelandish Märchen. End of chapter 31, recording by Jefferson Montoya, Las Vegas, Nevada, recorded in August 2011.
Chapter 32 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Patrick Reinhart. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. The Story of the Sham Prince, or the Ambitious Tailor. Once upon a time there lived a respectable young tailor called Labakan, who worked for a clever master in Alexandria. No one could call Labakan either stupid or lazy, for he could work extremely well and quickly, when he chose, but there was something not altogether right about him. Sometimes he would stitch away as fast as if he had a red-hot needle and a burning thread, and at other times he would sit lost in thought, and with such a queer look about him that his fellow workmen used to say, "Labakan has got on his aristocratic face today." On Fridays he would put on his fine robe which he had bought with the money he had managed to save up, and go to the mosque. As he came back after prayers, if he met any friend who said "Good day," or "How are you, friend Labakan?" he would wave his hand graciously, or nod in a condescending way, and if his master happened to say to him, as he sometimes did, "Really, Labakan, you look like a prince," he was delighted, and would answer, "Have you noticed it too?" or, "Well, so I have long thought." Things went on like this for some time, and the master put up with Labakan's absurdities because he was, on the whole, a good fellow and a clever workman. One day the Sultan's brother happened to be passing through Alexandria and wanted to have one of his state robes altered, so he sent for the master tailor, who handed the robe over to Labakan as his best workman. In the evening, when every one had left the workshop and gone home, a great longing drove Labakan back to the place where the royal robe hung. He stood a long time gazing at it, admiring the rich material and the splendid embroidery in it. At last he could hold out no longer. He felt he must try it on, and lo and behold! It fitted as though it had been made for him. "Am not I as good a prince as any other?" he asked himself, as he proudly paced up and down the room. "Has not the master often said that I seemed born to be a prince?" It seemed to him that he must be the son of some unknown monarch, and at last he determined to set out at once and travel in search of his proper rank. He felt as if the splendid robe had been sent him by some kind fairy, and he took care not to neglect such a precious gift. He collected all his savings, and, concealed by the darkness of the night, he passed through the gates of Alexandria. The new prince excited a good deal of curiosity wherever he went, for his splendid robe and majestic manner did not seem quite suitable to a person traveling on foot. If anyone asked questions, he only replied with an important air of mystery that he had his own reasons for not riding. However, he soon found out that walking made him ridiculous, so at last he bought a quiet, steady old horse, which he managed to get cheap. One day, as he was ambling along upon Merva, that was the horse's name, a horseman overtook him and asked leave to join him, so that they might both beguile the journey with pleasant talk. The newcomer was a bright, cheerful, good-looking young man, who soon plunged into conversation and asked many questions. He told Labakan that his own name was Omar, that he was a nephew of Elfi Bey, and was travelling in order to carry out a command given him by his uncle on his deathbed. Labakan was not quite so open in his confidences, but hinted that he too was of noble birth, and was travelling for pleasure. The two young men took a fancy to each other and rode on together. On the second day of their journey, Labakan questioned Omar as to the orders he had to carry out, and to his surprise heard this tale. Elfi Bey, Pacha of Cairo, had brought up Omar from his earliest childhood, and the boy had never known his parents. On his deathbed Elfi Bey called Omar to him, and then told him that he was not his nephew, but the son of a great king, who, having been warned of coming dangers by his astrologers, had sent the young prince away and made a vow not to see him till his 22nd birthday. Elfi Bey did not tell Omar his father's name, but expressly desired him to be at a great pillar 4 days' journey east of Alexandria, on the 4th day of the coming month, on which day he would be 22 years old. Here he would meet some men, to whom he was to hand a dagger which Elfi Bey gave him, and to say, "Here am I for whom you seek." If they answered, "Praised be the Prophet who has preserved you," he was to follow them, and they would take him to his father. Labakan was greatly surprised and interested by this story, but after hearing it, he could not help looking on Prince Omar with envious eyes, angry that his friend should have the position he himself longed so much for. He began to make comparisons between the prince and himself, and was obliged to confess that he was a fine-looking young man, with very good manners and a pleasant expression. At the same time he felt sure that had he been in the prince's place, any royal father might have been glad to own him. These thoughts haunted him all day, and he dreamt them all night. He woke very early, and as he saw Omar sleeping quietly, with a happy smile on his face, a wish arose in his mind to take by force or by cunning the things which an unkind fate had denied him. The dagger which was to act as a passport was sticking in Omar's girdle. Labakan drew it gently out, and hesitated for a moment whether or not to plunge it into the heart of the sleeping prince. However, he shrank from the idea of murder, so he contented himself with placing the dagger in his own belt, and saddling Omar's swift horse for himself, was many miles away before the prince woke up to realize his losses. For 2 days Labakan rode on steadily, fearing lest, after all, Omar might reach the meeting place before him. At the end of the 2nd day he saw the great pillar at a distance. It stood on a little hill in the middle of a plain, and could be seen a very long way off. Labakan's heart beat fast at the sight. Though he had had some time in which to think over the part he meant to play, his conscience made him rather uneasy. However, the thought that he must certainly have been born to be a king supported him, and he bravely rode on. The neighborhood was quite bare and desert, and it was a good thing that the new prince had brought food for some time with him, as 2 days were still wanting till the appointed time. Towards the middle of the next day he saw a long procession of horses and camels coming towards him. It halted at the bottom of the hill, and some splendid tents were pitched. Everything looked like the escort of some great man. Labakan made a shrewd guess that all these people had come here on his account. But he checked his impatience, knowing that only on the 4th day could his wishes be fulfilled. The first rays of the rising sun woke the happy tailor. As he began to saddle his horse and prepare to ride to the pillar, he could not help having some remorseful thoughts of the trick he had played, and the blighted hopes of the real prince. But the die was cast, and his vanity whispered that he was as fine looking a young man as the proudest king might wish his son to be, and that, moreover, what had happened had happened. With these thoughts he summoned up all his courage, sprang on his horse, and in less than a quarter of an hour was at the foot of the hill. Here he dismounted, tied the horse to a bush, and, drawing out Prince Omar's dagger, climbed up the hill. At the foot of the pillar stood 6 men round a tall and stately person. His superb robe of cloth of gold was girt round him by a white cashmere shawl, and his white, richly jewelled turban showed that he was a man of wealth and high rank. Labakan went straight up to him, and, bending low, handed him the dagger, saying, "Here am I whom you seek." "Praised be the Prophet who has preserved you," replied the old man with tears of joy. "Embrace me, my dear son Omar." The proud tailor was deeply moved by these solemn words, and with mingled shame and joy sank into the old king's arms. But his happiness was not long unclouded. As he raised his head he saw a horseman who seemed trying to urge a tired or unwilling horse across the plain. Only too soon Labakan recognized his own old horse, Merva, and the real Prince Omar, but having once told a lie he made up his mind not to own his deceit. At last the horseman reached the foot of the hill. Here he flung himself from the saddle and hurried up to the pillar. "Stop!" he cried, "whoever you may be, and do not let a disgraceful impostor take you in. My name is Omar, and let no one attempt to rob me of it." This turn of affairs threw the standers-by into great surprise. The old king in particular seemed much moved, as he looked from one face to the other. At last Labakan spoke with forced calmness. "Most gracious lord and father, do not let yourself be deceived by this man. As far as I know, he is a half-crazy tailor's apprentice from Alexandria, called Labakan, who really deserves more pity than anger." These words infuriated the prince. Foaming with rage, he tried to press towards Labakan, but the attendants threw themselves upon him and held him fast, whilst the king said, "Truly, my dear son, the poor fellow is quite mad. Let him be bound and placed on a dromedary. Perhaps we may be able to get some help for him." The prince's first rage was over, and with tears he cried to the king, "My heart tells me that you are my father, and in my mother's name I entreat you to hear me." "Oh, heaven forbid!" was the reply. "He is talking nonsense again. How can the poor man have got such notions into his head?" With these words the king took Labakan's arm to support him down the hill. They both mounted richly caparisoned horses and rode across the plain at the head of their followers. The unlucky prince was tied hand and foot and fastened on a dromedary, a guard riding on either side and keeping a sharp lookout on him. The old king was Sached, Sultan of the Wachabites. For many years he had had no children, but at length the son he had so long wished for was born. But the soothsayers and magicians whom he consulted as to the child's future all said that until he was 22 years old he stood in danger of being injured by an enemy. So, to make all safe, the Sultan had confided the prince to his trusty friend Elfi Bey, and deprived himself of the happiness of seeing him for 22 years. All this the Sultan told Labakan, and was much pleased by his appearance and dignified manner. When they reached their own country they were received with every sign of joy, for the news of the prince's safe return had spread like wildfire, and every town and village was decorated, whilst the inhabitants thronged to greet them with cries of joy and thankfulness. All this filled Labakan's proud heart with rapture, whilst the unfortunate Omar followed in silent rage and despair. At length they arrived in the capital, where the public rejoicings were grander and more brilliant than anywhere else. The queen awaited them in the great hall of the palace, surrounded by her entire court. It was getting dark, and hundreds of colored hanging lamps were lit to turn night into day. The brightest hung round the throne on which the queen sat, and which stood above 4 steps of pure gold inlaid with great amethysts. The 4 greatest nobles in the kingdom held a canopy of crimson silk over the queen, and the Sheikh of Medina fanned her with a peacock feather fan. In this state she awaited her husband and her son. She, too, had not seen Omar since his birth, but so many dreams had shown her what he would look like that she felt she would know him among 1,000. And now the sound of trumpets and drums and of shouts and cheers outside announced the long-looked-for moment. The doors flew open, and between rows of low-bending courtiers and servants the king approached the throne, leading his pretended son by the hand. "Here," said he, "is he for whom you have been longing for so many years." But the queen interrupted him. "That is not my son," she cried. "That is not the face the prophet has shown me in my dreams." Just as the king was about to reason with her, the door was thrown violently open, and Prince Omar rushed in, followed by his keepers, whom he had managed to get away from. He flung himself down before the throne, panting out, "Here will I die! Kill me at once, cruel father, for I cannot bear the shame any longer." Everyone pressed round the unhappy man, and the guards were about to seize him when the queen, who at first was dumb with surprise, sprang up from her throne. "Hold!" cried she. "This and no other is the right one. This is the one whom my eyes have never yet seen, but whom my heart recognizes." The guards had stepped back, but the king called to them in a furious voice to secure the madman. "It is I who must judge," he said in tones of command, "and this matter cannot be decided by women's dreams, but by certain unmistakable signs. This one," pointing to Labakan, "is my son, for it was he who brought me the token from my friend Elfi, the dagger." "He stole it from me!" shrieked Omar. "He betrayed my unsuspicious confidence!" But the king would not listen to his son's voice, for he had always been accustomed to depend on his own judgment. He let the unhappy Omar be dragged from the hall, whilst he himself retired with Labakan to his own rooms. Full of anger with the queen his wife, in spite of their many years of happy life together. The queen, on her side, was plunged in grief, for she felt certain that an impostor had won her husband's heart, and taken the place of her real son. When the first shock was over, she began to think how she could manage to convince the king of his mistake. Of course, it would be a difficult matter, as the man who declared he was Omar had produced the dagger as a token, besides talking of all sorts of things which happened when he was a child. She called her oldest and wisest ladies about her and asked their advice, but none of them had any to give. At last one very clever old woman said, "Did not the young man who brought the dagger call him whom your majesty believes to be your son Labakan, and say he was a crazy tailor?" "Yes," replied the queen, "but what of that?" "Might it not be," said the old lady, "that the impostor has called your real son by his own name? If this should be the case, I know of a capital way to find out the truth." And she whispered some words to the queen, who seemed much pleased, and went off at once to see the king. Now the queen was a very wise woman, so she pretended to think she might have made a mistake, and only begged to be allowed to put a test to the two young men to prove which was the real prince. The king, who was feeling much ashamed of the rage he had been in with his dear wife, consented at once, and she said, "No doubt others would make them ride or shoot, or something of that sort, but everyone learns these things. I wish to set them a task which requires sharp wits and clever hands, and I want them to try which of them can best make a kaftan and pair of trousers." The king laughed. "No, no, that will never do. Do you suppose my son would compete with that crazy tailor as to which could make the best clothes? Oh dear no, that won't do at all." But the queen claimed his promise, and as he was a man of his word, the king gave in at last. He went to his son and begged that he would humour his mother, who had set her heart on his making a kaftan. The worthy Labakan laughed to himself. "If that is all she wants," thought he, "her majesty will soon be pleased to own me." 2 rooms were prepared, with pieces of material, scissors, needles, and threads, and each young man was shut up in one of them. The king felt rather curious as to what sort of garment his son would make, and the queen too was very anxious as to the result of her experiment. On the 3rd day they sent for the 2 young men and their work. Labakan came first and spread out his kaftan before the eyes of the astonished king. "See, father," he said, "see, my honoured mother, if this is not a masterpiece of work. I'll bet the court tailor himself cannot do better." The queen smiled, and turned to Omar. "And what have you done, my son?" Impatiently he threw the stuff and scissors down on the floor. "I have been taught how to manage a horse, to draw a sword, and to throw a lance some 60 paces, but I never learnt to sew, and such a thing would have been thought beneath the notice of the pupil of Elfi Bey, the ruler of Cairo." "Ah, true son of your father!" cried the queen. "If only I might embrace you and call you son! Forgive me, my lord and husband," she added, turning to the king, "for trying to find out the truth in this way. Do you not see yourself now which is the prince and which the tailor? Certainly this caftan is a very fine one, but I should like to know what master taught this young man how to make clothes." The king sat deep in thought, looking now at his wife and now at Labakan, who was doing his best to hide his vexation at his own stupidity. At last the king said, "Even this trial does not satisfy me, but happily I know of a sure way to discover whether or not I have been deceived." He ordered his swiftest horse to be saddled, mounted, and rode off alone into a forest at some little distance. Here lived a kindly fairy called Adolzaide, who had often helped the kings of his race with her good advice, and to her he betook himself. In the middle of the forest was a wide open space surrounded by great cedar trees, and this was supposed to be the fairy's favourite spot. When the king reached this place he dismounted, tied his horse to the tree, and standing in the middle of the open place said, "If it is true that you have helped my ancestors in their time of need, do not despise their descendant, but give me counsel, for that of men has failed me." He had hardly finished speaking when one of the cedar trees opened, and a veiled figure all dressed in white stepped from it. "I know your errand, King Sached," she said. "It is an honest one, and I will give you my help. Take these 2 little boxes, and let the 2 men who claim to be your son choose between them. I know that the real prince will make no mistake." She then handed him 2 little boxes made of ivory set with gold and pearls. On the lid of each, which the king vainly tried to open, was an inscription in diamonds. On one stood the words "Honor and Glory," and on the other "Wealth and Happiness." "It would be a hard choice," thought the king as he rode home. He lost no time in sending for the queen and for all his court, and when all were assembled he made a sign, and Labakan was led in. With a proud air he walked up to the throne, and, kneeling down, asked, "What does my lord and father command?" The king replied, "My son, doubts have been thrown on your claim to that name. One of these boxes contains the proofs of your birth. Choose for yourself. No doubt you will choose right." He then pointed to the ivory boxes, which were placed on 2 little tables near the throne. Labakan rose and looked at the boxes. He thought for some minutes, and then said, "My honored father, what can be better than the happiness of being your son, and what nobler than the riches of your love? I choose the box with the words, 'Wealth and Happiness.' We shall see presently if you have chosen the right one. For the present, take a seat there beside the Pacha of Medina," replied the king. Omar was next led in, looking sad and sorrowful. He threw himself down before the throne and asked what was the king's pleasure. The king pointed out the 2 boxes to him, and he rose and went to the tables. He carefully read the 2 mottos and said, "The last few days have shown me how uncertain is happiness, and how easily riches vanish away. Should I lose a crown by it, I make my choice of honor and glory. He laid his hand on the box as he spoke, but the king signed to him to wait, and ordered Labakan to come to the other table, and lay his hand on the box he had chosen. Then the king rose from his throne, and in solemn silence all present rose too, whilst he said, "Open the boxes, and may Allah show us the truth." The boxes were opened with the greatest ease. In the one Omar had chosen lay a little gold crown and sceptre on a velvet cushion. In Labakan's box was found a large needle with some thread. The king told the two young men to bring him their boxes. They did so. He took the crown in his hand, and as he held it, it grew bigger and bigger, till it was as large as a real crown. He placed it on the head of his son Omar, kissed him on the forehead, and placed him on his right hand. Then, turning to Labakan, he said, "There's an old proverb, 'The cobbler sticks to his last.' It seems as though you were to stick to your needle. You have not deserved any mercy, but I cannot be harsh on this day. I give you your life, but I advise you to leave this country as fast as you can." Full of shame, the unlucky tailor could not answer. He flung himself down before Omar, and with tears in his eyes asked, "Can you forgive me, prince?" "Go in peace," said Omar as he raised him. "Oh, my true son!" cried the king as he clasped the prince in his arms, whilst all the pachas and emirs shouted, "Long live Prince Omar!" In the midst of all the noise and rejoicing, Labakan slipped off with his little box under his arm. He went to the stables, saddled his old horse Merva, and rode out of the gate towards Alexandria. Nothing but the ivory box with its diamond motto was left to show him that the last few weeks had not been a dream. When he reached Alexandria he rode up to his old master's door. When he entered the shop his master came forward to ask what was his pleasure, but as soon as he saw who it was he called his workmen, and they all fell on Labakan with blows and angry words, till at last he fell, half fainting, on a heap of old clothes. The master then scolded him soundly about the stolen robe, but in vain Labakan told him he had come to pay for it, and offered 3 times its price. They only fell to beating him again, and at last pushed him out of the house, more dead than alive. He could do nothing but remount his horse and ride to an inn. Here he found a quiet place in which to rest his bruised and battered limbs, and to think over his many misfortunes. He fell asleep, fully determined to give up trying to be great, but to lead the life of an honest workman. Next morning he set to work to fulfill his good resolutions. He sold his little box to a jeweler for a good price, bought a house and opened a workshop. Then he hung up a sign with "Labakan, Tailor" over his door, and sat down to mend his own torn clothes, with the very needle which had been in the ivory box. After a while he was called away, and when he went back to his work he found a wonderful thing had happened. The needle was sewing away all by itself, and making the neatest little stitches, such as Labakan had never been able to make even at his best. Certainly, even the smallest gift of a kind fairy is of great value, and this one had yet another advantage, for the thread never came to an end, however much the needle sewed. Labakan soon got plenty of customers. He used to cut out the clothes, make the first stitch with the magic needle, and then leave it to do the rest. Before long the whole town went to him, for his work was both so good and so cheap. The only puzzle was how he could do so much, working all alone, and also why he worked with closed doors. And so the promise on the ivory box of wealth and happiness came true for him, and when he heard of all the brave doings of Prince Omar, who was the pride and darling of his people and the terror of his enemies, the ex-prince thought to himself, "After all, I am better off as a tailor, for honor and glory are apt to be very dangerous things." End of The Story of the Sham Prince, or The Ambitious Tailor.
Chapter 33 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jenny Lundak. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 33. The Colony of Cats. Long, long ago, as far back as the time when animals spoke, there lived a community of cats, in a deserted house they had taken possession of not far from a large town. They had everything they could possibly desire for their comfort. They were well fed and well lodged, and if by any chance an unlucky mouse was stupid enough to venture in their way, they caught it, not to eat it, but for the pure pleasure of catching it. The old people of the town related how they had heard their parents speak of a time when the whole country was so overrun with rats and mice that there was not so much as a grain of corn nor an ear of maize to be gathered in the fields, and it might be out of gratitude to the cats who had rid the country of these plagues that their descendants were allowed to live in peace. No one knows where they got the money to pay for everything, nor who paid for it, for this all happened so very long ago. But one thing is certain: they were rich enough to keep a servant, for though they lived very happily together and did not scratch nor fight more than human beings would have done, they were not clever enough to do the housework themselves, and preferred at all events to have someone to cook their meat, which they would have scorned to eat raw. Not only were they very difficult to please about the housework, but most women quickly tired of living alone with only cats for companions. Consequently, they never kept a servant long, and it had become a saying in the town, when anyone found herself reduced to her last penny, "I will go and live with the cats." And so many a poor woman actually did. Now Lizina was not happy at home, for her mother, who was a widow, was much fonder of her elder daughter, so that often the younger one fared very badly, and had not enough to eat, while the elder could have everything she desired. And if Lizina dared to complain, she was certain to have a good beating. At last the day came when she was at the end of her courage and patience, and exclaimed to her mother and sister, "As you hate me so much, you will be glad to be rid of me, so I am going to live with the cats." "Be off with you!" cried her mother, seizing an old broom handle from behind the door. Poor Lizina did not wait to be told twice, but ran off at once, and never stopped till she reached the door of the cat's house. Their cook had left them that very morning, with her face all scratched, the result of such a quarrel with the head of the house that he had very nearly scratched out her eyes. Lizina, therefore, was warmly welcomed, and she set to work at once to prepare the dinner, not without many misgivings as to the tastes of the cats, and whether she would be able to satisfy them. Going to and fro about her work, she found herself frequently hindered by a constant succession of cats, who appeared one after another in the kitchen to inspect the new servant. She had one in front of her feet, another perched on the back of her chair while she peeled the vegetables, a third sat on the table beside her, and 5 or 6 others prowled about the pots and pans on the shelves against the wall. The air resounded with their purring, which meant that they were pleased with their new maid, but Lizina had not yet learned to understand their language, and often she did not know what they wanted her to do. However, as she was a good, kind-hearted girl, she set to work to pick up the little kittens which tumbled about the floor. She patched up quarrels and nursed on her lap a big tabby, the oldest of the community, which had a lame paw. All these kindnesses could hardly fail to make a favorable impression on the cats, and it was even better after a while, when she had had time to grow accustomed to their strange ways. Never had the house been kept so clean, the meats so well served, nor the sick cats so well cared for. After a time they had a visit from an old cat whom they called their father, who lived by himself in a barn at the top of the hill, and came down from time to time to inspect the little colony. He too was much taken with Lizina, and inquired on first seeing her, "Are you well served by this nice black-eyed little person?" And the cats answered with one voice, "Oh yes, Father Gatto, we have never had so good a servant." At each of his visits the answer was always the same, but after a time the old cat, who was very observant, noticed that the little maid had grown to look sadder and sadder. "What is the matter, my child? Has anyone been unkind to you?" he asked one day when he found her crying in the kitchen. She burst into tears and answered between her sobs, "Oh no, they are all very good to me, but I long for news from home, and I pine to see my mother and my sister." Old Gatto, being a sensible old cat, understood the little servant's feelings. "You shall go home," he said, "and you shall not come back here unless you please. But first you must be rewarded for all your kind services to my children. Follow me down into the inner cellar, where you have never yet been, for I always keep it locked and carry the key away with me." Lizina looked round her in astonishment as they went down into the great vaulted cellar underneath the kitchen. Before her stood the big earthenware water jars, one of which contained oil, the other a liquid shining like gold. "In which of these jars shall I dip you?" asked Father Gatto, with a grin that showed all his sharp white teeth, while his moustaches stood out straight on either side of his face. The little maid looked at the 2 jars from under her long dark lashes. "In the oil jar," she answered timidly, thinking to herself, "I could not ask to be bathed in gold." But Father Gatto replied, "No, no, you have deserved something better than that," and seizing her in his strong paws he plunged her into the liquid gold. Wonder of wonders! When Lizina came out of the jar She shone from head to foot like the sun in the heavens on a fine summer's day. Her pretty pink cheeks and long black hair alone kept their natural color. Otherwise she had become like a statue of pure gold. Father Gatto purred loudly with satisfaction. "Go home," he said, "and see your mother and sisters. But take care, if you hear the cock crow, to turn towards it. If, on the contrary, the ass brays, you must look the other way." The little maid, having gratefully kissed the white paw of the old cat, set off for home. But just as she got near her mother's house the cock crowed, and quickly she turned towards it. Immediately a beautiful golden star appeared on her forehead, crowning her glossy black hair. At the same time the ass began to bray, but Lizina took care not to look over the fence into the field where the donkey was feeding. Her mother and sister, who were in front of their house, uttered cries of admiration and astonishment when they saw her, and their cries became still louder when Lizina, taking her handkerchief out of her pocket, drew out also a handful of gold. For some days the mother and her two daughters lived very happily together, for Lizina had given them everything she had brought away except her golden clothing, for that would not come off, in spite of all the efforts of her sister, who was madly jealous of her good fortune. The golden star, too, could not be removed from her forehead, but all the gold pieces she drew from her pockets had found their way to her mother and sister. "I will go now and see what I can get out of the pussies," said Peppina, the elder girl, one morning, as she took Lizina's basket and fastened her pockets into her own skirt. "I should like some of the cat's gold for myself," she thought, as she left her mother's house before the sun rose. The cat colony had not yet taken another servant, for they knew they could never get one to replace Lizina, whose loss they had not yet ceased to mourn. When they heard that Peppina was her sister, they all ran to meet her. "She is not the least like her," the kittens whispered among themselves. "Hush! Be quiet!" the older cat said. "All servants cannot be pretty." No, decidedly she was not at all like Lizina. Even the most reasonable and large-minded of the cats soon acknowledged that. The very first day she shut the kitchen door in the face of the tomcats, who used to enjoy watching Lizina at her work, and a young and mischievous cat, who jumped in by the open window and alighted on the table, got such a blow with the rolling-pin that he squalled for an hour. With every day that passed the household became more and more aware of its misfortune. The work was badly done, as the servant was surly and disagreeable. In the corners of the rooms there were collected heaps of dust. Spiders' webs hung from the ceilings and in front of the window panes. The beds were hardly ever made, and the feather beds, so beloved by the old and feeble cats, had never once been shaken since Lizina left the house. At Father Gatto's next visit he found the whole colony in a state of uproar. "Caesar has one paw so badly swollen that it looks as if it were broken," said one. "Peppina kicked him with her great wooden shoes on. Hector has an abscess in his back where a wooden chair was flung at him. And Agrippina's 3 little kittens have died of hunger beside their mother, because Peppina forgot them in their basket up in the attic. There is no putting up with the creature. Do send her away, Father Gatto. Lizina herself would not be angry with us. She must know very well what her sister is like." "Come here," said Father Gatto, in his most severe tones, to Peppina, and he took her down into the cellar and showed her the same 2 great jars that he had showed Lizina. "In which of these shall I dip you?" he asked, and she made haste to answer, "In the liquid gold," for she was no more modest than she was good and kind. Father Gatto's yellow eyes darted fire. "You have not deserved it," he uttered in a voice like thunder, and seizing her he flung her into the jar of oil, where she was nearly suffocated. When she came to the surface screaming and struggling, the vengeful cat seized her again and rolled her in the ash heap on the floor. Then, when she rose, dirty, blinded, and disgusting to behold, he thrust her from the door, saying, "Begone, and when you meet a braying ass, be careful to turn your head towards it." Stumbling and raging, Peppina set off for home, thinking herself fortunate to find a stick by the wayside with which to support herself. She was within sight of her mother's house when she heard in the meadow on the right the voice of a donkey loudly braying. Quickly she turned her head towards it, and at the same time put her hand up to her forehead, where, waving like a plume, was a donkey's tail. She ran home to her mother at the top of her speed, yelling with rage and despair, and it took Lizina 2 hours, with a big basin of hot water and 2 cakes of soap, to get rid of the layer of ashes with which Father Gatto had adorned her. As for the donkey's tail, it was impossible to get rid of that. It was as firmly fixed on her forehead as was the golden star on Lizina's. Their mother was furious. She first beat Lizina unmercifully with the broom. Then she took her to the mouth of the well and lowered her into it, leaving her at the bottom weeping and crying for help. Before this happened, however, the king's son, in passing the mother's house, had seen Lizina sitting sewing in the parlour, and had been dazzled by her beauty. After coming back 2 or 3 times, he at last ventured to approach the window and to whisper in the softest voice, "Lovely maiden, will you be my bride?" And she had answered, "I will." Next morning, when the prince arrived to claim his bride, he found her wrapped in a large white veil. "It is so that maidens are received from their parents' hands," said the mother, who hoped to make the king's son marry Peppina in place of her sister, and had fastened the donkey's tail round her head like a lock of hair under the veil. The prince was young and a little timid, so he made no objections, and seated Peppina in the carriage beside him. Their way led past the old house inhabited by cats, who were all at the window, for the report had got about that the prince was going to marry the most beautiful maiden in the world, on whose forehead shone a golden star, and they knew that this could only be their adored Lizina. As the carriage slowly passed in front of the old house, where cats from all parts of the world seemed to be gathered, a song burst from every throat. "Mew, mew, mew, Prince, look behind you. In the well is fair Lizina, and you've got nothing but Peppina." When he heard this, the coachman, who understood the cat's language better than the prince, his master, stopped his horses and asked, "Does your Highness know what the grimalkins are saying?" And the song broke forth even louder than ever. With a turn of his hand the prince threw back the veil and discovered the puffed up, swollen face of Peppina, with the donkey's tail twisted round her head. "Ah, traitress!" he exclaimed, and ordering the horses to be turned around, he drove the elder daughter, quivering with rage, to the old woman who had sought to deceive him. With his hand on the hilt of his sword he demanded Lizina in so terrific a voice that the mother hastened to the well to draw her prisoner out. Lizina's clothing and her star shone so brilliantly that when the prince led her home to the king, his father, the whole palace was lit up. Next day they were married and lived happily ever after, and all the cats, headed by old Father Gatto, were present at the wedding. End of chapter 33. Recording by Jenny Lundak, South Padre Island. Recorded in February 2011.
Chapter 34 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 34. How to Find Out a True Friend. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who longed to have a son. As none came, one day they made a vow at the shrine of St. James that if their prayers were granted the boy should set out on a pilgrimage as soon as he had passed his 18th birthday. And fancy their delight when one evening the king returned home from hunting and saw a baby lying in the cradle. All the people came crowding round to peep at it, and declared it was the most beautiful baby that ever was seen. Of course, that is what they always say, but this time it happened to be true. And every day the boy grew bigger and stronger till he was 12 years old, when the king died, and he was left alone to take care of his mother. In this way 6 years passed by, and his 18th birthday drew near. When she thought of this, the queen's heart sank within her, for he was the light of her eyes, and how was she going to send him forth to the unknown dangers that beset a pilgrim? So day by day she grew more and more sorrowful, and when she was alone wept bitterly. Now the queen imagined that no one but herself knew how sad she was, but one morning her son said to her, "Mother, why do you cry the whole day long?" "Nothing, nothing, my son. There is only one thing in the world that troubles me." "What is that one thing?" asked he. "Are you afraid your property is badly managed? Let me go and look into the matter." This pleased the queen, and he rode off to the plain country, where his mother owned great estates. But everything was in beautiful order, and he returned with a joyful heart and said, "Now, mother, you can be happy again, for your lands are better managed than anyone else's I have seen. The cattle are thriving, the fields are thick with corn, and soon they will be ripe for harvest." "This is good news indeed," answered she, but it did not seem to make any difference to her, and the next morning she was weeping and wailing as loudly as ever. "Dear mother," said her son in despair, "if you will not tell me what is the cause of all this misery, I shall leave home and wander far through the world." "Ah, my son, cried the queen, "it is the thought that I must part from you which causes me such grief. For before you were born we vowed a vow to St. James that when your 18th birthday was passed you should make a pilgrimage to his shrine, and very soon you will be 18 and I shall lose you, and for a whole year my eyes will never be gladdened by the sight of you, for the shrine is far away." "Will it take no longer than that to reach it?" said he. "Oh, don't be so wretched. It is only dead people who never return. As long as I am alive you may be sure I will come back to you." After this manner he comforted his mother, and on his 18th birthday his best horse was led to the door of the palace, and he took leave of the queen in these words, "Dear mother, farewell, and by the help of fate I shall return to you as soon as I can." The queen burst into tears and wept sore. Then amidst her sobs she drew 3 apples from her pocket and held them out, saying, "My son, take these apples and give heed unto my words. You will need a companion in the long journey on which you are going. If you come across a young man who pleases you, beg him to accompany you, and when you get to an inn invite him to have dinner with you. After you have eaten, cut one of these apples in 2 unequal parts and ask him to take one. If he takes the larger bit, then part from him, for he is no true friend to you. But if he takes the smaller bit, treat him as your brother, and share with him all you have." Then she kissed her son once more, and blessed him, and let him go. The young man rode a long way without meeting a single creature, but at last he saw a youth in the distance about the same age as himself, and he spurred his horse till he came up with a stranger, who stopped and asked, "Where are you going, my fine fellow?" "I am making a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James, for before I was born my mother vowed that I should go forth with a thank offering on my 18th birthday." "That is my case too," said the stranger, "and as we must both travel in the same direction, let us bear each other company." The young man agreed to this proposal, but he took care not to get on terms of familiarity with the newcomer until he had tried him with the apple. By and by they reached an inn, and at sight of it the king's son said, "I am very hungry. Let us enter and order something to eat." The other consented, and they were soon sitting before a good dinner. When they had finished, the king's son drew an apple from his pocket and cut it into a big half and a little half, and offered both to the stranger, who took the biggest bit. "You are no friend of mine," thought the king's son, and in order to part company with him he pretended to be ill and declared himself unable to proceed on his journey. "Well, I can't wait for you," replied the other. "I am in haste to push on, so farewell." "Farewell," said the king's son, glad in his heart to be rid of him so easily. The king's son remained in the inn for some time, so as to let the young man have a good start. Then he ordered his horse and rode after him. But he was very sociable, and the way seemed long and dull by himself. "Oh, if I could only meet with a true friend," he thought, "so that I should have someone to speak to. I hate being alone." Soon after he came up with a young man, who stopped and asked him, "Where are you going, my fine fellow?" The king's son explained the object of his journey, and the young man answered, as the other had done, that he also was fulfilling the vow of his mother made at his birth. "Well, we can ride on together," said the king's son, and the road seemed much shorter now that he had someone to talk to. At length they reached an inn, and the king's son exclaimed, "I am very hungry. Let us go in and get something to eat." When they had finished, the king's son drew an apple out of his pocket and cut it in two. He held the big bit and the little bit out to his companion, who took the big bit at once and soon ate it up. "You are no friend of mine," thought the king's son, and began to declare that he felt so ill he could not continue his journey. When he had given the young man a good start he set off himself, but the way seemed even longer and duller than before. "Oh, if I could only meet with a true friend, he should be as a brother to me," he sighed sadly. And as the thought passed through his mind he noticed a youth going the same road as himself. The youth came up to him and said, "Which way are you going, my fine fellow?" And for the third time the king's son explained all about his mother's vow. "Why, that is just like me!" cried the youth. "Then let us ride on together," answered the king's son. Now the miles seemed to slip by, for the newcomer was so lively and entertaining that the king's son could not help hoping that he indeed might prove to be the true friend. More quickly than he could have thought possible they reached an inn by the roadside, and turning to his companion the king's son said, "I am hungry. Let us go in and have something to eat." So they went in and ordered dinner, and when they had finished the king's son drew out of his pocket the last apple, and cut it into two unequal parts, and held both out to the stranger. And the stranger took the little piece, and the heart of the king's son was glad within him, for at last he had found the friend he had been looking for. "Good youth," he cried, "we will be brothers, and what is mine shall be thine, and what is thine shall be mine, and together we will push on to the shrine, and if one of us dies on the road the other shall carry his body there." And the stranger agreed to all he said, and they rode forward together. It took them a whole year to reach the shrine, and they passed through many different lands on their way. One day they arrived tired and half starved in a big city, and said to one another, "Let us stay here for a little and rest before we set forth again." So they hired a small house close to the royal castle, and took up their abode there. The following morning the king of the country happened to step onto his balcony, and saw the young men in the garden, and said to himself, "Dear me, those are wonderfully handsome youths, but one is handsomer than the other, and to him will I give my daughter to wife." And indeed the king's son excelled his friend in beauty. In order to set about his plan the king asked both the young men to dinner, and when they arrived at the castle he received them with the utmost kindness, and sent for his daughter, who was more lovely than both the sun and moon put together. But at bedtime the king caused the other young man to be given a poisoned drink, which killed him in a few minutes, for he thought to himself, "If his friend dies the other will forget his pilgrimage, and will stay here and marry my daughter." When the king's son awoke the next morning he inquired of the servants where his friend had gone, as he did not see him. "He died suddenly last night," said they, "and is to be buried immediately." But the king's son sprang up and cried, "If my friend is dead I can stay here no longer, and cannot linger an hour in this house." "Oh, give up your journey and remain here," exclaimed the king, "and you shall have my daughter for your wife." "No," answered the king's son, "I cannot stay. But I pray you grant my request, and give me a good horse, and let me go in peace, and when I have fulfilled my vow then I will return and marry your daughter." So the king, seeing no words would move him, ordered a horse to be brought round, and the king's son mounted it, and took his dead friend before him on the saddle, and rode away. Now the young man was not really dead, but only in a deep sleep. When the king's son reached the shrine of St. James, he got down from his horse, took his friend in his arms as if he had been a child, and laid him before the altar. "St. James," he said, "I have fulfilled the vow my parents made for me. I have come myself to your shrine, and have brought my friend. I place him in your hands. Restore him to life, I pray, for though he be dead yet, he has fulfilled his vow also." And behold, while he yet prayed, his friend got up and stood before him as well as ever, and both the young men gave thanks, and set their faces towards home. When they arrived at the town where the king dwelt, they entered the small house over against the castle. The news of their coming spread very soon, and the king rejoiced greatly that the handsome young prince had come back again, and commanded great feasts to be prepared, for in a few days his daughter should marry the king's son. The young man himself could imagine no greater happiness, and when the marriage was over they spent some months at the court making merry. At length the king's son said, "My mother awaits me at home, full of care and anxiety. Here I must remain no longer, and tomorrow I will take my wife and my friend and start for home." And the king was content that he should do so, and gave orders to prepare for their journey. Now in his heart the king cherished a deadly hate towards the poor young man whom he had tried to kill, but who had returned to him living, and in order to do him hurt, sent him on a message to some distant spot. "See that you are quick," said he, "for your friend will await your return before he starts." The youth put spurs to his horse and departed, bidding the prince farewell, so that the king's message might be delivered the sooner. As soon as he had started, the king went to the chamber of the prince and said to him, "If you do not start immediately you will never reach the place where you must camp for the night." "I cannot start without my friend," replied the king's son. "Oh, he will be back in an hour," replied the king, "and I will give him my best horse, so that he will be sure to catch you up." The king's son allowed himself to be persuaded, and took leave of his father-in-law, and set out with his wife on his journey home. Meanwhile the poor friend had been unable to get through his task in the short time appointed by the king, and when at last he returned the king said to him, "Your comrade is a long way off by now. You had better see if you can overtake him." So the young man bowed and left the king's presence, and followed after his friend on foot, for he had no horse. Night and day he ran, till at length he reached the place where the king's son had pitched his tent, and sank down before him, a miserable object, worn out and covered with mud and dust. But the king's son welcomed him with joy, and tended him as he would his brother. And at last they came home again, and the queen was waiting and watching in the palace, as she had never ceased to do since her son had rode away. She almost died of joy at seeing him again, but after a little she remembered his sick friend, and ordered a bed to be made ready, and the best doctors in all the country to be sent for. When they heard of the queen's summons they flocked from all parts, but none could cure him. After everyone had tried and failed, a servant entered and informed the queen that a strange old man had just knocked at the palace gate and declared that he was able to heal the dying youth. Now this was a holy man who had heard of the trouble the king's son was in, and had come to help. It happened that at this very time a little daughter was born to the king's son, but in his distress for his friend he had barely a thought to spare for the baby. He could not be prevailed on to leave the sick bed, and he was bending over it when the holy man entered the room. "Do you wish your friend to be cured?" asked the newcomer of the king's son, "and what price would you pay?" "What price?" answered the king's son. "Only tell me what I can do to heal him." "Listen to me then," said the old man. "This evening you must take your child, and open her veins, and smear the wounds of your friend with her blood, and you will see, and he will get well in an instant." At these words the king's son shrieked with horror, for he loved the baby dearly, but he answered, "I have sworn that I would treat my friend as if he were my brother, and if there is no other way, my child must be sacrificed." As by this time evening had already fallen, he took the child and opened its veins, and smeared the blood over the wounds of the sick man, and the look of death departed from him, and he grew strong and rosy once more. But the little child lay as white and still as if she had been dead. They laid her in the cradle and wept bitterly, for they thought that by the next morning she would be lost to them. At sunrise the old man returned and asked after the sick man. "He is as well as ever," answered the king's son. "And where is your baby?" "In the cradle yonder, and I think she is dead," replied the father sadly. "Look at her once more," said the holy man, and as they drew near the cradle, there lay the baby smiling up at them. "I am St. James of Lycia," said the old man, "and I have come to help you, for I have seen that you are a true friend. From henceforward live happily, all of you, together, and if trouble should draw near to you, send for me, and I will aid you to get through them." With these words he lifted his hand in blessing and vanished. And they obeyed him, and were happy and content, and tried to make the people of the land happy and contented too. From Sicilianische Marahen Ganzenbach. End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 35. Clever Maria. There was once a merchant who lived close to the royal palace and had 3 daughters. They were all pretty, but Maria, the youngest, was the prettiest of the 3. One day the king sent for the merchant, who was a widower, to give him directions about a journey he wished the good man to take. The merchant would rather not have gone, as he did not like leaving his daughters at home, but he could not refuse to obey the king's commands, and with a heavy heart he returned home to say farewell to them. Before he left, he took 3 pots of basil and gave one to each girl, saying, "I am going a journey, but I leave these pots. You must let nobody into the house. When I come back they will tell me what has happened." "Nothing will have happened," said the girls. The father went away, and the following day the king, accompanied by 2 friends, paid a visit to the 3 girls, who were sitting at supper. When they saw who was there, Maria said, "Let us go and get a bottle of wine from the cellar. I will carry the key, my eldest sister can take the light, while the other brings the bottle." But the king replied, "Oh, do not trouble, we are not thirsty." "Very well, we will not go," answered the 2 elder girls, but Maria merely said, "I shall go anyhow." She left the room and went to the hall, where she put out the light, and putting down the key and the bottle, ran to the house of a neighbor, and knocked at the door. "Who is there so late?" asked the old woman, thrusting her head out of the window. "Oh, let me in," answered Maria. "I have quarreled with my eldest sister, and as I do not want to fight any more, I have come to beg you to allow me to sleep with you." So the old woman opened the door, and Maria slept in her house. The king was very angry at her for playing truant, but when she returned home the next day she found the plants of her sisters withered away, because they had disobeyed their father. Now the window in the room of the eldest overlooked the gardens of the king, and when she saw how fine and ripe the medlars were on the trees, she longed to eat some, and begged Maria to scramble down by a rope and pick her a few, and she would draw her up again. Maria, who was good-natured, swung herself into the garden by the rope and got the medlars, and was just making the rope fast under her arms, so as to be hauled up, when her sister cried, "Oh, there are such delicious lemons a little farther on. You might bring me 1 or 2." Maria turned round to pluck them, and found herself face to face with the gardener, who caught hold of her, exclaiming, "What are you doing here, you little thief?" "Don't call me names," she said, "or you will get the worst of it," giving him, as she spoke, such a violent push that he fell panting into the lemon bushes. Then she seized the cord and clambered up to the window. The next day the second sister had a fancy for bananas, and begged so hard that, though Maria had declared she would never do such a thing again, at last she consented, and went down the rope into the king's garden. This time she met the king, who said to her, "Ah, here you are again, cunning one. Now you shall pay for your misdeeds." And he began to cross-question her about what she had done. Maria denied nothing, and when she had finished, the king said again, "Follow me to the house, and there you shall pay the penalty." As he spoke, he started for the house, looking back from time to time to make sure that Maria had not run away. All of a sudden, when he glanced round, he found she had vanished completely, without leaving a trace of where she had gone. Search was made all through the town, and there was not a hole or corner which was not ransacked, but there was no sign of her anywhere. This so enraged the king that he became quite ill, and for many months his life was despaired of. Meanwhile the two elder sisters had married the two friends of the king, and were the mothers of little daughters. Now, one day Maria stole secretly to the house where her elder sister lived, and snatching up the children, put them into a beautiful basket she had with her, covered with flowers inside and out, so that no one would ever guess it held two babies. Then she dressed herself as a boy, and placing the basket on her head, she walked slowly past the palace, crying as she went, "Who will carry these flowers to the king, who lies sick of love?" And the king in his bed heard what she said, and ordered one of his attendants to go out and buy the basket. It was brought to his bedside, and as he raised the lid, cries were heard, and peeping in he saw two little children. He was furious at this new trick, which he felt had been played on him by Maria, and was still looking at them, wondering how he should pay her out, when he was told that the merchant, Maria's father, had finished the business on which he had been sent, and returned home. Then the king remembered how Maria had refused to receive his visit, and how she had stolen his fruit, and he determined to be revenged on her. So he sent a message by one of his pages, that the merchant was to come to see him the next day, and bring with him a coat made of stone, or else he would be punished. Now the poor man had been very sad since he got home the evening before, for though his daughters had promised that nothing should happen while he was away, he had found the two elder ones married without asking his leave. And now there was this fresh misfortune, for how was he to make a coat of stone? He wrung his hands and declared that the king would be the ruin of him, when Maria suddenly entered. "Do not grieve about the coat of stone, dear father, but take this bit of chalk, and go to the palace and say you have come to measure the king." The old man did not see the use of this, but Maria had so often helped him before that he had confidence in her, so he put the chalk in his pocket and went to the palace. "That is no good," said the king when the merchant had told him what he had come for. "Well, I can't make the coat you want," replied he. "Then if you would save your head, hand over to me your daughter Maria." The merchant did not reply, but went sorrowfully back to his house, where Maria sat waiting for him. "Oh, my dear child, why was I born? The king says that instead of the coat I must deliver you up to him." "Do not be unhappy, dear father, but get a doll made exactly like me, with a string attached to its head, which I can pull for yes and no." So the old man went out at once to see about it. The king remained patiently in his palace, feeling sure that this time Maria could not escape him, and he said to his pages, "If a gentleman should come here with his daughter and ask to be allowed to speak with me, put the young lady in my room and see she does not leave it." When the door was shut on Maria, who had concealed the doll under her cloak, she hid herself under the couch, keeping fast hold of the string which was fastened to its head. "Señora Maria, I hope you are well," said the king when he entered the room. The doll nodded. "Now we will reckon up accounts," continued he, and he began at the beginning and ended up with the flower basket, and at each fresh misdeed Maria pulled the string, so that the doll's head nodded assent. "Whoso mocks at me merits death," declared the king when he had ended, and drawing his sword cut off the doll's head. It fell towards him, and as he felt the touch of a kiss, he exclaimed, "Ah, Maria, Maria, so sweet in death, so hard to me in life. The man who could kill you deserves to die." And he was about to turn his sword on himself, when the true Maria sprung out from under the bed, and flung herself into his arms. And the next day they were married and lived happily for many years. From the Portuguese. End of chapter 35. Recording by Maria Therese.
Chapter 36 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jenny Lundak. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 36. The Magic Kettle. Right in the middle of Japan, high up among the mountains, an old man lived in his little house. He was very proud of it, and never tired of admiring the whiteness of his straw mats and the pretty papered walls, which in warm weather always slid back so that the smell of the trees and flowers might come in. One day he was standing looking at the mountain opposite, when he heard a kind of rumbling noise in the room behind him. He turned round, and in the corner he beheld a rusty old iron kettle, which could not have seen the light of day for many years. How the kettle got there the old man did not know, but he took it up and looked it over carefully, and when he found that it was quite whole he cleaned the dust off it and carried it into his kitchen. That was a piece of luck, he said, smiling to himself. A good kettle costs money, and it is well to have a second one at hand in case of need. Mine is getting worn out, and the water is already beginning to come through its bottom. Then he took the other kettle off the fire, filled the new one with water, and put it in its place. No sooner was the water in the kettle getting warm than a strange thing happened, and the man, who was standing by, thought he must be dreaming. First the handle of the kettle gradually changed its shape and became a head, and the spout grew into a tail, while out of the body sprang 4 paws, and in a few minutes the man found himself watching, not a kettle, but a tanuki. The creature jumped off the fire and bounded about the room like a kitten, running up the walls and over the ceiling, till the old man was in an agony lest his pretty room should be spoilt. He cried to a neighbor for help, and between them they managed to catch the tanuki and shut him up safely in a wooden chest. Then, quite exhausted, they sat down on the mats and consulted together what they should do with this troublesome beast. At length they decided to sell him, and bade a child who was passing send them a certain tradesman called Jemmu. When Jemmu arrived, the old man told him that he had something which he wished to get rid of, and he lifted the lid of the wooden chest where he had shut up the tanuki. But to his surprise, no tanuki was there, nothing but the kettle he had found in the corner. It was certainly very odd, but the man remembered what had taken place on the fire, and did not want to keep the kettle any more. So after a little bargaining about the price, Jemmu went away carrying the kettle with him. Now Jemmu had not gone very far before he felt that the kettle was getting heavier and heavier, and by the time he reached home he was so tired that he was thankful to put it down in the corner of his room, and then forgot all about it. In the middle of the night, however, he was awakened by a loud noise in the corner where the kettle stood, and raised himself up in bed to see what it was. But there was nothing there except the kettle, which seemed quiet enough. He thought that he must have been dreaming, and fell asleep again, only to be roused a second time by the same disturbance. He jumped up and went to the corner, and by the light of a lamp that he always kept burning he saw that the kettle had become a tanuki, which was running round after his tail. After he grew weary of that, he ran on the balcony, where he turned several somersaults from pure gladness of heart. The tradesman was much troubled as to what to do with the animal, and it was only towards morning that he managed to get any sleep. But when he opened his eyes again, there was no tanuki, only the old kettle that he had left there the night before. As soon as he had tidied his house, Jemmu set off to tell his story to a friend next door. The man listened quietly, and did not appear so surprised as Jemmu expected, for he recollected having heard in his youth something about a wonder-working kettle. "Go and travel with it, and show it off," he said, "and you will become a rich man. But be careful first to ask the Tanuki's leave, and also to perform some magic ceremonies to prevent him from running away at the sight of the people." Jimmu thanked his friend for his counsel, which he followed exactly. The Tanuki's consent was obtained, a booth was built, and a notice was hung up outside it, inviting the people to come and witness the most wonderful transformation that ever was seen. They came in crowds, and the kettle was passed from hand to hand, and they were allowed to examine it all over, and even to look inside. Then Jimmu took it back, and setting it on a platform, commanded it to become a tanuki. In an instant the handle began to change into a head, and the spout into a tail, while the 4 paws appeared at the sides. "Dance," said Jimmu, and the tanuki did his steps, and moved first on one side and then on the other, till the people could not stand still any longer, and began to dance too. Gracefully he led the fan dance, and glided without a pause into the shadow dance and the umbrella dance, and it seemed as if he might go on dancing forever. And so very likely he would, if Jimmu had not declared he had danced enough, and that the booth must now be closed. Day after day the booth was so full it was hardly possible to enter it, and what the neighbor foretold had come to pass, and Jimmu was a rich man. Yet he did not feel happy. He was an honest man, and he thought that he owed some of his wealth to the man from whom he had bought the kettle. So one morning he put 100 gold pieces into it, and hanging the kettle once more on his arm, he returned to the seller of it. "I have no right to keep it any longer," he added when he had ended his tale, "so I have brought it back to you, and inside you will find 100 gold pieces as the price of its hire." The man thanked Jimmu and said that few people would have been as honest as he, and the kettle brought them both luck, and everything went well with them till they died, which they did when they were very old, respected by everyone. Adapted from Japanese Marchen. End of chapter 36. Recording by Jenny Lundak, South Padre Island, Texas. Recorded in March 2011. End of the Crimson Fairy Book by Andrew Lang.